and welcome to the Alley Interviews. In today's session, we speak with Professor Anthony Wensley, who is the Director of ICCIT, the Institute of Culture, Communications and Technology. Anthony is a well-known and beloved professor here at UTM, and he shares with us his personal experience of managing finances when he was an undergrad. And his stories have elements that we can all relate to. So I hope you enjoyed this session with Professor Wensley.
I mean, this is a public forum, so.
Yes.
No, I was not.
Edited version.
I was not. In terms of studying, I was a very bad student because in England, the degrees are 3 years, and you don't have to go to. There was no requirement to go to lectures, and indeed, for the first 2 years, I would take exams at the end of each year, but the exams bore very little relationship to the lectures. You went to lectures because you want to listen to the professors, not necessarily, in most cases, that it had any direct effect on your ability to do the exams. And so I could probably count on the fingers of probably 2 hands the number of lectures I went to in the course of a year. And as a result, I spent most of my time being with friends, listening to music, reading a lot, because morning till night.
You seem to have a lot of other activities. So
yes.
From a financial perspective, like what kind of financial concerns did you have when you were an undergrad?
It was a different world then.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to pay. I wasn't responsible. I didn't have to pay any fees. There were no fees because in England it was means tested, but my parents didn't earn enough money to have to pay fees to the university, which were fairly low anyway. What my parents did have to pay was my living expenses. Right. Now, it's a long time ago, but there were some advantages in terms of living expenses because since most of the time, most of the 3 years was spent in residence in the college I was in, and residence provided food in a meal plan, but it was a pretty easy, you come home from lectures and so on, and the easy thing was to eat in the college, and that was relatively cheap. Right. So that wasn't a problem. My money sort of didn't disappear on that direction. It disappeared in at least 2 directions, which have probably remained constant since then. One of them was, I'm afraid, alcohol. Because there was, and indeed it was a problem in the sense that in the Cambridge system, it separated into colleges, and the colleges are residential mostly, but each college essentially has at least one bar. And a tab. So you would run a tab during the term, and that was pretty problematic. I don't actually remember sort of worrying too much about how much I had to pay, but clearly it was that perhaps was because I was thinking about it when I'd had too much to drink anyway. And I guess the other thing that I tended to spend money on, apart from, the films and so on, but actually those are quite cheap. I mean, entertainment was relatively cheap because it was student entertainment, and typically I wasn't a real party hound, but when I went to parties, the most you were expected to take was a bottle of something. Right. And in fact, and I shouldn't admit it, but at that time was the time of particularly LSD and other such sort of drugs. Ooh. And so most people were providing...
I'm tempted to ask you other questions, but I won't.
No. I do honestly admit that I did not participate. Okay. But so the other thing I tended to spend my money on were books, which, as I said, still, as my wife will attest, is an obsession I have, and music. So I had a large music.
So alcohol, books, and music. Those are your top three.
Well, yeah, I think alcohol was a little lower. It's still, I mean, still
it's still around there somewhere.
And so, actually, at the end of every academic term, when everything was sort of, in a sense, added up, I would be in deficit, and those were the days when you could actually meet your bank manager. So my bank manager at the end of the academic year, if this would occur, well, it occurred at the end of every academic year, even when I graduated, would call me into his office. He was based in a small village somewhere around the university, and would ask me what I was going to do about my overdraft. Now, the overdraft sort of was not, in today's terms, a major amount of money. I can't remember, but it was probably probably £1,000. So, probably a couple of $1,000, but it's quite an achievement. Given my parents weren't giving me a lot of money, but enough, and I typically didn't go to them to ask for more. Right. I don't remember doing that. And I would sit down with my bank manager and explain how, as I always did, I would work through the summer. Typically pretty menial jobs. I was a fruit picker most summers, but I managed a travel agency for one summer and so on. Nice. And I would explain to my bank manager how he said, "What are you going to do about this overdraft?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm going to work in the summer and I'll save money and I'll pay off my overdraft." Right. That worked the first year. The second year, he said, "I seem to have heard this story somewhere before, and it didn't seem to result in anything."
So did you pay it off in the first year and rack it up again? No, you didn't. Okay.
No. So I still had, and rather like many of my students now, but a much greater amount for them. I graduated with not insignificant overdraft, and then of course had the difficulty of working. And I always commented that my first job in teaching in England, I was paid roughly twice as much as my father was paid in his first job in 1937. Wow. So I was paid about $1,200 a year, which is quite £1,200 a year, which is ludicrous. Yeah. But found it very difficult to pay off this overdraft. I probably took me about 2 years because
So you graduated with student debt.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah,
and it was ordinary bank debt rather.
Right. Yes. So it wasn't a student loan, but you graduated and you had debt to pay off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm not a good example of managing well. And I was thinking, of sort of what advice I might have, and one of the weird pieces of advice I had that I recognized in a sense when I was at university is that, Cambridge is probably no different, or is no different in many ways than any other university, and you have students who have varying abilities to consume and pay for things. Yes. And so you have students who are really have no worries whatsoever. They can spend as much money as they want. And you have a lot of students who really, there are actually a lot of students who are sort of living from hand to mouth and so on. And the difficulty is to some extent, the sort of friends I associated with, by no means all of them, but some of them were very well off. And the difficulty is, and it's still true in a sense, that I wasn't mature enough nor understood how much money you have to appear not to care about how much money you have. And so they consume things, or you join them, They want to go somewhere and you say, I'll come along, and of course you didn't want to appear not to have money, so you spent money.
Because you want to fit in, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that really, I think, even now, it's not, obviously it's not the same level.
It's a societal problem.
It's a societal problem, and it's not direct peer pressure. It's just you have a group and they want to do interesting and nice things, and those things cost money, or and you get sort of just into that frame of mind. And I think it's even easier now, in a sense. It's just like, it's so easy to buy things online and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And suddenly,
and social media, the influencing people.
And come up against suddenly come up against credit limits and so on and so forth. I never have been very good at budgeting. I've always felt I ought to be. But I have occasions when I get totally enthused about it. But
it's not a habit that you have.
It's not a habit, and if you're going to do it, and I think it's not compulsively, but it would have been a good idea if I'd got more into at least part of that habit younger.
Yeah.
Now it's a lost cause, really, in a sense.
But you're married to an accountant, so that should help a little bit.
Well, she just gives up.
After a while, it's like
no. I mean, and again, in terms of there's a limit to how much you can say. And I used to have a budget, but then you get into discussions about what actually is covered by the budget and what isn't, and so on.
This is a budget item.
But I think seriously. I mean, I think apart from my sort of, two things. One is I've been lucky because at the time, as I said, I was an undergraduate student.
And it was a different time.
It was a different time.
Yeah.
There was enough, essentially. And if there wasn't, it was my fault. But also, again, being able, nowadays, having an overdraft is, the notion of an overdraft for a student, and the bank just tolerating you sort of spending money that you didn't have is unusual.
Yeah.
And by the time I became a student again, as I said, when I did my graduate work, what with scholarships and so on, that was not a problem, and fees were much lower then than they are now. And when I was a PhD student, most of the time I was actually working full-time and being a PhD student, and had a wife who was working full-time too. So I've been remarkably lucky. My inability to manage money very well hasn't actually bitten me very much.
Well, you managed to compensate it by earning more, so it kind of balances out.
That is true. Though again, easier, and it is possible to budget more conveniently now than it used to be.
But the thing is, you've raised some really essential points, and that it's difficult when you have to do it later, which means it's all the more reason why we should be teaching students even really early on. Because it's not so much about the money in your hands, it's about the attitude and the behavior that goes with that.
Yeah.
And so if we can get students to start really early on, just, it doesn't have to, use the word budget and you think straitjacket. But I like to think of budget as a way to finance your lifestyle. So if students can have that attitude towards the budget, it's more about financing what you want from your life. And so the earlier you start training having those behavioral traits, it wouldn't be so tedious when you never had to do it before, right?
Yeah.
So it'll just be as a matter of fact, and that's, this is the whole purpose of the LE interviews and the LE survey and the LE program, is just to kind of raise awareness for students, saying like, look, you have to start, and you have to start early, and the earlier you start, the better off you'll be, because it's training your behavior and then managing what you do have, and it'll be easier then.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, and again, it's something that most of students sort of have to go back at least 2 generations is normal. I mean, when my parents first visited me here, they are, as parents of my generation, they went through the Depression years, as my parents-in-law did, and they had a very different attitude, and basically debt was, even if debt was acceptable, it was only acceptable in a mortgage. Yeah, and even I don't think we didn't even have car loans. I don't think. I don't think my parents bought. When they'd saved enough money to buy a car, they'd buy a car. And so my parents' reaction when they come here, and they saw all these ads for going on, borrow money to go on holiday. I mean, to them it was an alien universe. It was something you just would not do. And indeed, as I said, even in the cases of my parents-in-law, even having a mortgage was unacceptable, really. They knew they had to have one, but the sooner they got rid of it, the better. And so, but nowadays one's sort of got so many, it's so easy to consume, it's so relatively easy to borrow, it's so easy to rack up your credit cards and so on and so forth, that sort of, I mean, it's just like the fact that I always say here now, I mean, I never spend cash, literally never, because I pay for everything on my credit cards.
Yes.
And quite that, you know, you look at the amount at the end of the month and it's figures on a page. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of, it's not saying you should go around and pay in
but this is what
pennies,
I'm saying. You have to have that self-monitoring. If you have, if you're tapping everywhere you go, or swiping, in the case might be, you really have to have that internal kind of self-check. Because if you don't, the numbers will get bigger and bigger on the sheet.
And it's a simple result of math. But I mean, it's just amazing how quickly things add up, because you say, well, I only spent $15 here and $10 here. But when you're doing it 20 times a day or something,
and
it's
not
just,
constantly
I mean,
thinking
really
about it.
Yes, exactly.
That's good. So I wanted to ask one question before we finish. And that question is, if you weren't a prof, if you weren't an academic, what would you be?
If I wasn't academic, what would I be? Yeah, one of my students asked me a couple of days ago, if I had my life to live again, what would I do? I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, because it's with the limited abilities I have, you know, being an academic, sort of, I delight in being able to use those to the maximum extent, though be around people who are much better than I am. But, you know, I could say, because I'm a very bad, very bad musician, you know, I'd like to be a musician.
Awesome.
But realistically...
no, we're not realistic. We're going for the big dream.
In many of these things, you then, and I have friends who are musicians, and you realize...
So what genre of music would you be in?
Classical.
Classical.
And
what instrument?
Cello.
Oh, wow.
No
you see, he can answer those questions. He knows exactly the genre and exactly the instrument.
Probably pretty good.
But,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time
you.
to come and talk to us on the other interview.
That was lovely. Thank you so much.